Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Peter Goddard, Director of the Institute for Advanced Study, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon to this Institute lecture. After the lecture, there'll be a reception to which you're all invited in Fuld Hall. Our speaker today is Danielle Allen, who joined the Institute as UPS Foundation Professor in the School of Social Science last July. Danielle obtained her bachelor's degree in classics, summa cum laude, from Princeton University in 1993, and a PhD in classics from the University of Cambridge in 1996. In 1997, she became Assistant Professor of Classical Languages and Literature at Chicago University, progressing to Associate Professor in Political Science as well as Classics in 2000, and then Professor in 2003. In the meantime, additionally, she'd obtained a master's degree in 1997 and a second PhD in 2001, this time in political theory from Harvard University. In 2004, she became Dean of the Division of Humanities in the University of Chicago. Amongst very many other achievements, Danielle has won a number of awards for poetry, including the Daddy Rylands Prize from King's College, Cambridge, and from 2002 to 2006, she was a MacArthur Fellow. Danielle is widely known for her work on justice and citizenship in ancient Athens and its application to modern America. She's published The World of Prometheus, The Politics of Punishing in Democratic Athens in 2000, and Talking to Strangers, Anxieties of Citizenship Since Brown versus Board of Education in 2004. At present, amongst a number of other topics, she's working on a theoretical study of politics and change. Today, her title is What to Do with Sound Bites, Politics and Propaganda in the 21st Century.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Philip. Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you, first of all, Director Goddard, for a lovely introduction, and to the Institute generally for welcoming me so warmly this year. I am delighted to be a new member of the faculty and feel myself already thriving in the intellectual environment presented here. So today my lecture is What to Do with Sound Bites on Politics and Propaganda in the 21st Century. This story actually starts 7 years ago, is it already that long, in 2000. And actually, in fact, before I fully launch in, I should say, as you heard from the introduction, I'm a humanist by training, which means I've been trained primarily to read and write. Those are my major skills. And so actually engaging all of you this evening in an experiment in the lecture form. Now that humanists find themselves often not only lecturing, but having their lectures videotaped, as this one is, reading a lecture doesn't work as well in that media as one, in the medieval period, reading a lecture was adequate in itself. And so I'm experimenting with a different form of presentation tonight. So I appreciate your willingness to engage with me in this experiment. And I'll be curious as well to have afterwards any thoughts or responses on the difference between hearing a read lecture and hearing a presentation in this form with lots of visual accompaniments and things like that. But at any rate, as I said, what to do with sound bites. The story starts in 2000. Like many of us, in December of 2000, I was just consumed by the question of what was going to be the outcome of the presidential election. As you know, Bush v. Gore was before the Supreme Court. At the same time that I was consumed by this political question, I was also teaching Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, and in particular, teaching books 6 and 7 of that text. Those are the books that concern the expedition of the Athenians to Sicily. And you can see from the map, this is the effort of the Athenians to conquer the very large island on the bottom of the boot of Italy. Thucydides is very snide about the expedition. He says, although the Athenians tried once already to conquer the island, even so, they still hadn't figured out exactly how big it was and how many inhabitants it had. At any rate, I was teaching books 6 and 7, and the primary protagonists in books 6 and 7 are two men named Nicias and Alcibiades. Nicias was sort of the elder statesman in Athens, a man of great piety and much respected within the city. Alcibiades was the young Turk, or the cowboy, essentially in the spirit, leading a new generation of politicians. They had a very heated debate in front of the city assembly about whether to go to war. And as I was reading this, I suddenly realized that Thucydides was telling us something important about political language. Nicias's syntax was incredibly complicated, very woolly. Alcibiades, in contrast, was direct, blunt. So I'm going to just show you the openings of their two respective speeches so you get a sense. These are my translations, and I've made them word-for-word translations, though the complexity here is not a matter of the Greek, it is a matter of how Nicias is writing in particular. This assembly was called about our preparations in order to discuss what we would need to sail against Sicily, but it seems to me that it is still necessary to deliberate about this very matter, whether it is better to send the ships, or better not, thus on the basis of a brief discussion about great matters and having been persuaded by foreigners to take up a war that doesn't belong to us. Are you still following me? I won't read the whole next sentence. I mean, it comes a bit later, but it's still part of the opening. Here's Alcibiades. It is appropriate for me, rather than others, O Athenians, to have the command. And I must begin with this point since Nicias has attacked me, and I also think that I am worthy of it. Our fathers, who had both these adversaries, whom it is said we will leave behind when we sail, and also had the Persians as an enemy, acquired an empire with no strength other than the superiority of their navy. I suspect you can already hear the difference between the two sentences. Now let me just read to you. Okay. So it speaks for itself. I'll read it anyway. Gore, this is the remarks Gore made when he conceded the election. Good evening. Just moments ago, I spoke with George W. Bush and congratulated him on becoming the 43rd President of the United States. And I promised him that I wouldn't call him back this time. I offered to meet with him as soon as possible so that we can start to heal the divisions of the campaign and the contest through which we've just passed. Almost a century and a half ago, Senator Stephen Douglas told Abraham Lincoln, who had just defeated him for the presidency, "Partisan feeling must yield to patriotism. I'm with you, Mr. President, and God bless you." Well, in that same spirit, I say to President-elect Bush that what remains of partisan rancor must now be put aside, and may God bless his stewardship of this country. Doesn't sound that bad, certainly doesn't sound as bad as Nicias, but thank you very much. Good evening, my fellow Americans. I appreciate so very much the opportunity to speak with you tonight. Mr. Speaker, Lieutenant Governor, and friends, distinguished guests, our country has been through a long and trying period, with the outcome of the presidential election not finalized for longer than any of us could ever imagine. Vice President Gore and I put our hearts and hopes into our campaigns. We both gave it our all. We shared similar emotions. So I understand how difficult this moment must be for Vice President Gore and his family. He has a distinguished record of service to our country as a congressman, a senator, and a vice president. Let's take a closer look. And what one notices is that it's the use of subordination by each of the two speakers that makes the difference between an extremely complex expression, actually, and something simpler. Coordination and subordination. All right. Okay. So the red indicates those elements of the syntax. And Bush. Okay? So I suddenly realized political language does make a really big difference. And in fact, it seemed to me we could probably attribute a significant portion of Bush's success to his capacity to speak directly. I began to use this general attention to syntax in politicians to watch politics and consider or try to judge what outcomes were likely to be. The scenario that I just went through essentially repeated itself in 2004, as you can imagine. Kerry's syntax, if anything, was more elaborate and more complex than Gore's had been, and Bush continued to speak in this fashion. Again, longest sentences. I'll let you just read them for yourselves rather than reading them out. So these are from the same two speeches. And if you pay attention in this to the verbal elements, this is what makes the difference in the relative ease we have in assimilating one sentence or another on hearing. Bush has fewer verbal elements and fewer in essentially subordinate positions, And he also uses verbs that have more concrete metaphors immediately behind them, like heal, call, work, solve. Gore is using abstractions: accept, discharge, define, affirm. What image do you have in your head on the basis of those words? You don't. So, when I picked my subject for this lecture at the end of November, I thought, well, this will be useful to talk about sound bites during the political season. It's bound to be something that people can make use of afterwards for their own involvement with politics. I had no idea that events would overtake me to the degree that they have. It has seemed in some ways that the campaign has become primarily a battle about whether sound bites are worth anything or not. So what are sound bites? Here are two fragments that I've picked up just in the last month. One from a local radio station as part of its fundraising drive, Substance Beyond Sound Bites, the radio announcer said that the station offers. Or, it's time for solutions, not sound bites. I thought that was a Clinton statement originally, but then when I looked for the actual moment when she'd said it, although she had said it, I also found that it's been said by any number of politicians around the country over the last couple of years. So, these are cliches, both of them, and they each make a statement about sound bites. The first tells us that sound bites are superficial. They don't offer acute analysis. The second draws a contrast between speech and action. But of course, each of these things is also in itself a sound bite. So in addition to what they say about sound bites, we need to ask what these statements actually exhibit as features as sound bites. They both, of course, exhibit alliteration, the S's, substance and soundbite, and solutions and soundbite. And then they also both exhibit antithesis. Beyond allows for drawing a contrast. One thing is here, another is beyond it, and similarly, the not in the second one allows for antithesis. Both of these verbal elements, the alliteration and the antithesis, make the comments easy to remember. They're mnemonic techniques. So one of the things we need to keep in mind about sound bites is that at their core, they're about portability. You hear it and you remember it easily, you can carry it around. And so they become one of the elements that's central to the replication of culture over time. So, there's more to be said, though, about sound bites in terms of the work they do in helping to construct culture. So, just catch up with myself. In terms of thinking about a soundbite, then, as using the power of mnemonic techniques to help produce portable linguistic bits, it occurred to me that Dawkins' concept of meme might be relevant here. And so I won't elaborate on that right now, but if others have thoughts about that afterwards, I would be delighted to hear them. Should we think of sound bites as part of the material that we are generating culturally and that does allow for evolution over time, speciation in cultural ideas, and so forth? The other important thing to say about the function of soundbite, though, as something that carries bits of culture around, is that the entire point of a soundbite is that the question of ownership should disappear. You want a soundbite to become authoritative. You want it to become a bit of commonly spoken language that circulates across time and space and solves problems of time and space that bedevil communication. And precisely because one wants this, one can consider a soundbite successful precisely when no one can any longer claim authorship to it. So let me give you some more examples of how soundbites travel. So who knows where this is from? I'm curious. Thank you. Good. Alrighty. But who knows where it really comes from? Okay. So, worth noting again the importance of alliteration to the movement of a fragment of language from one context to another, and also the importance of antithesis. We're still using strong contrast. The other important thing about noticing this very small movement of a fragment of language is that it means that Lincoln's expression, the world will little note nor long remember, was not only an expression of modesty, it was also a small expression of frustration. These people don't learn well. Doesn't matter how much you talk to them. It's not clear that they will easily learn and long remember. In fact, they're likely to little note and not long remember. So the meanings shift, too, in this circulation. But then, sound bites do cultural work. They circulate across time and space, and therefore allow for communication, particularly in mass contexts. What is the actual substance of their culture-building work? We need to turn to a more theoretical account, and we are given such an account in Aristotle's text on rhetoric. This book is one that's not often taken to be part of Aristotle's political theory, but it can and should be read with the ethics and the politics. Read as such, the politics is the book about constitutions, and then the rhetoric is the book about judgment. Aristotle is very specific that, in his view, the employment of persuasive speeches is directed towards a judgment. For when a thing is known and judged, there is no longer any need of argument. And there is judgment whether a speaker addresses himself to a single individual or to many. What does it mean to say that the rhetoric is a book about judgment, or to see judgment as one of the core activities of politics? Judgment is the decision on how to define what a community thinks of itself as being, as well as decisions about the actions a community wishes to undertake. And it's easy to think about the role of judgment in monarchies, where a king is essentially the figure of judgment for the polity, but judgment is equally important in a democracy. And the three contexts in which democratic citizens regularly judge are elections, of course, and juries, but also in the realm of culture, when we do make choices about what we want to listen to or not listen to. So sound bites then become a part of the conversation that we have in elections, in juries, but also generally as we work with each other on crafting our common culture. So judges apply laws to a set of facts. Similarly, we all, citizens in action, whether personal or political, apply the bundle of principles that we may happen to have to decisions before us. So law and the realm of judgment are related to each other in this fashion. We may not always be self-aware of the principles that are at work in our judgments, and all sorts of psychological phenomena may well impinge on the process. But generally, we all operate with some set of principles about how to respond to different sorts of scenarios. So a very important question for democratic practice and for democratic political judgment is how the demos, the people, gets the principles for its judgment. Aristotle's answer to that is that we get our principles for judgment through maxims, or what in Greek were called gnome. In other words, the same word that the Greeks used to describe judgment generally, gnome, which is the Greek word in the third line there, is also the word that they used for sound bites. Okay. So what did Aristotle have to say about sound bites? Before moving into that, just two examples from Homer. In order to truth in advertising, I said Homer was the first purveyor of sound bites on the flyer about this lecture, so here's some examples of what scholars typically take as gnomic statements from Homer. No one can match the honors dealt to a king, and a man weighed down with cares must not sleep through the night. You're going to keep the midnight oil burning. A maxim, or gnome, is a statement not concerning particulars, not, for instance, about what sort of a man Iphicrates is, but a general statement. It doesn't even deal with all general things, but with the objects of human actions, and with what should be chosen or avoided with reference to them. Aristotle expands his analysis by bringing in the idea of character. Maxims make speeches ethical. Speeches have this character in which the moral purpose, the prohairesis, is clear. And this is the effect of all maxims, because he who employs them in a general manner declares his moral preferences. If then the maxims are good, they show the speaker also to be of good character. This is importantly a very different idea about the role of character in politics than we typically use now in our common conversations about politics. We take the question of character to be a question about what the person has done in their private life. Have they used drugs? Have they had an affair with such, and so forth? Aristotle's argument in the Rhetoric is that all we need to know about a politician's character is expressed through their words. and that their job is, through speaking, to convey the basis on which they'll make choices. And it's our job to interpret from their maxims how they will make choices and use that as an assessment of their character. But we need some examples to understand this. So here are examples Aristotle offers of maxims or sound bites. No one who is sensible should teach his children to be excessively clever. Okay. Know thyself and everything in moderation. For each of those, we are able to take from them information about the speaker's character in Aristotle's terms, but in the context where that means both how they think of themselves as an individual and how they would guide their actions for a community or on behalf of a community, and how they also would hope to guide the actions that belong to the community in particular, to itself. So democratic citizens, perhaps consciously and perhaps not, ask themselves when they listen to a politician whether they want the bundle of principles entailed in or implied in whatever maxims or sound bites the politician has offered them. But surely that's a lot of pressure to put on sound bites, this claim that as politicians are up in front of us saying things like substance beyond sound bites and so forth, that what we're getting is in fact a compressed version of entire worldview. In order to justify that claim, I need to explain how sound bites actually exhibit specific reasoning process. And again, Aristotle offers us the account. There are two parts to it. First of all, maxims are the premises or conclusions of logical arguments about human affairs without the syllogism. So for the classicists in the audience, I should insert a footnote saying that the bit in brackets is standing in for the word enthymeme. Okay, but everybody else can ignore that. So what does this mean exactly? What does this tell us about the reasoning entailed in the use of sound bites? The standard example of a syllogism is the following. Socrates is a human being. Human beings are mortal. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Two premises leading to a necessary conclusion. So a maxim by Aristotle's account is one of the premises or the conclusion, but without the other bits. You don't make the whole argument. So but what that does mean is that each maxim itself is part of a coherent logical structure and therefore should, in fact, convey logical coherence. This means that when we listen to sound bites, we are testing their logical coherence. So I'd like to give you an example of one that failed the test and therefore got revised. So the first is John McCain speaking on February 13th. To encourage a country with only rhetoric rather than sound and proven ideas that trust in the strength and courage of free people is not a promise of hope, it is a platitude. I think instinctively you probably registered the incoherence, but let me just point it out for you. The green indicates the concepts that are linked by an is. To encourage is not a promise, it is a platitude. Okay? And ideas that trust. Ideas can't trust. People can trust. Right now, I sound like your 6th grade grammar teacher at this point, but I can't help myself. Okay? So McCain's advisors clearly recognized that this was incoherent. Well, I mean, sorry, just grammatically. And as a consequence, revised this for him. The important point, though, about this revision is not only that they recognized that it was incoherent, but they recognized that it would be perceived as incoherent. And in their recognition, what we actually get is a very good glimpse at what democratic common sense is about. That basic linguistic capacity allows people to tell the difference between coherent and incoherent statements. Okay? So when people talk about democratic common sense, that's the capacity, I think, that they're identifying. So here's the revised version. I will fight every moment of every day in this campaign to make sure Americans are not deceived by an eloquent but empty call for change that promises no more than a holiday from history, I'm emphasizing the alliteration, and a return to false promises and failed policies of a tired philosophy that trusts in government more than people. Okay. So the second element of the reasoning involved in sound bites is more complicated. The moral purpose should be made clear by the language, or else one should add the reason. In other words, the soundbite should be self-evident, ideally. But if it's not, you need to add the because clause or the for clause to explain it. This is another important insight about democratic common sense. So whereas we expect everybody to be able to tell the difference between coherence and incoherence, we recognize that unpacking the substance of the soundbite is harder. And we hope that it can happen through processes of self-evidence, but we don't expect to rely on that. Democratic common sense isn't quite as powerful in coming to grips with the substance entailed in soundbites as it is simply at recognizing their coherence. So, this is a challenge to self-evidence with explanation as the fallback. So what does adding the reason actually mean in practice? Know thyself I take to be a self-evident soundbite. And actually, I thought that the second one was not self-evident, but the fact that you all laughed the first time it came up means I'm wrong. So, but at any rate, my guess is you probably can't guess what Aristotle's reason for this maxim is. Okay? So that's what it means to add the reason, and he presents these by first giving us the maxim and then sort of waiting a few paragraphs and then tossing in the reason. Or, there is no one who is really free, for all are slaves of either wealth or luck. And the first maxim about education articulates a theory about human development. Human development should help people, in some sense, be able to stay in the category of the middling person, the person who can fit in with ordinary people. And if education violates that essentially democratic norm, it's doing damage. Okay, that was the theory behind the first maxim. And the theory behind this maxim is that human beings have to recognize their limits and essentially the problem of finitude. It's essentially the argument of a philosopher like Martha Nussbaum about moral luck. Okay, as a consequence of moral luck, nobody is really free. So here's another soundbite which is important to this country, and it's worth noting that of the 4 remaining candidates in the presidential primary, 3 of them regularly invoke this soundbite when asked the question of what's your guiding principle. So that's how commonly it's used. And not only is it that 3 of the 4 of them invoke it, and they're of the 4 who are left, the other important point is that of all the candidates who started, there are the only 3 of the whole group who used it. Okay? So at any rate, what's the theory behind this one? We hold indicates the belief that a community can come together to define the truths that will make it who it is and the basis for its actions. The idea of self-evidence suggests, so community self-definition. The idea of self-evidence suggests that that community can be, in theory, universally expandable. Anyone should be able to join with the community in holding dear the principle of equality and in living by a principle of equality. And in this quotation, created, of course, points to the fact that for these authors, these authors worked from a worldview and a value system secured by a belief in a divine creator, but simultaneously the quotation conveys, or the soundbite conveys, a resistance to naming the Christian God in particular. So let's go back to our original soundbites and add 2 more. I've added McCain's eloquent but empty call for change, and I've added Barack Obama's don't tell me words don't matter, don't tell me ideals and inspiration don't matter. Can we unpack these in order to understand the reasons behind them and the theories or visions of politics that they convey? Substance beyond soundbites, in the first instance, conveys the notion that there is room for multiple types of discourse and complementary communities. Beyond is not the strong antithesis, but what the soundbite indicates is that, for example, there's a community of scholars or scholarly types who can provide something, substance, analysis, that amplifies what soundbites can offer. The radio show, then, in other words, is suggesting that its job is to add complementary pieces to public discourse. It's time for solutions, not soundbites, draws a contrast between speech and action in a way that pushes speech out of the domain of what's necessary in politics. as the point of a soundbite like this is that solutions are achieved separately from discursive processes. Eloquent but empty call for change accepts the idea that eloquence matters in politics and presses on the point that one needs to judge the content of the reasoning. So in other words, the coherence of expression is not sufficient. One needs also to press on the second element of reasoning to unpack the reasons before one responds to a call, because one responds to calls. And in the last one, what we get is an account that links speech specifically to ideals and inspiration, and in some sense, in fact, articulates an Aristotelian idea of the role of speech in politics, in the sense that words are converted into ideals, maxims, or sound bites, one could say, and that then those also provide inspiration. They provide motivation to action. But the important point is that the specific form the words are given credit for achieving is the form of an ideal, a principle around which action is based and around which institutions are built. So we do get theories in each of these sound bites, but the conversation doesn't stop there. Once one person throws out a sound bite, another person counters. And of course, you will all have recognized that these 4 sound bites are already the parrying of different candidates with one another. And as we watch the competition among sound bites unfold, we can in fact see a theoretical argument unfolding. So let me throw in another link in the competition here about sound bites. Again, Barack Obama. We are the party of Jefferson, who wrote the words that we are still trying to heed, that all of us are created equal, that all of us deserve the chance to pursue our happiness. We're the party of Jackson, who took back the White House for the people of this country. We're the party of a man who overcame his own disability to tell us that the only thing we had to fear was fear itself, who faced down fascism and liberated a continent from tyranny. And we're the party of a young president who asked what we could do for our country and then challenged us to do it. This set of sound bites elaborates on the connection between words, ideals, and inspiration that Obama had drawn in the very compressed sound bite. He makes the specific point in the first paragraph that words do convert into cliches that become the basis on which a culture and community builds itself, or rather words are converted, that they grow into the cliches that become the basis for community building. In that regard, he recognizes this point that Aristotle is making about the relationship between language and the evolution of culture. Then he also, in particularly the third and fourth paragraphs, makes specific points about the relationship between principles on which communities can be built and the capacity of principles of that kind, in particular, to motivate action. For Senator Clinton, too, the argument unfolded. It's time that we moved from good words to good work, from sound bites to sound solutions. The results that I have been part of producing for the last 35 years are rooted in my dreams for a better future. We all carry dreams in our hearts, and we need to keep dreaming. Dreaming keeps us hopeful, it lifts our spirits, it sets our sights high. Without dreams, you can't aspire to be great, but without action, we cannot turn those dreams into reality. So in this, she's moved beyond, well, yes, exactly, she's moved beyond the stark antithesis, the knot between sound bites and solutions, and instead is using supplementary language. Like you're going to move from good words to good work, so that's an evolution in the argument. And she accepts the evolution in the argument on the basis of the idea that words are crucial for inspiration, specifically. So she amplifies that idea and describes the relationship between inspiration and action. What's important, though, is that she's missed part of the argument, right? So she's responded to the part of the original Obama quotation that was about inspiration, but she has not responded to the part that was about ideals. And so, in fact, we are seeing in the exchange of sound bites between them a real argument about the role of language in politics and its capacity, or lack thereof, to be at the basis of building communities, institutions, and common understandings of who and what we are. So, this enables us to tell a general story about how sound bites work in democratic politics. I hope that's visible enough and that the writing is not too small. In the upper left-hand corner, you've got, it says competing sound bites. Let's see if I can use that. Can everybody see that okay? All right, okay. So what I've just given you is I've excerpted from our public discourse, our current public discourse, a set of competing sound bites. And I have made the argument that democratic citizens are presented with those sound bites with an occasion for judgment. And there are two kinds of judgment involved, one of coherence and one of content. And the hard part about democratic politics will always be the question of how well citizens are prepared for that moment of judgment. Then personal, and the argument is that once citizens make judgments, then particular sound bites or cliches become the basis both for personal and cultural action organized around core ideas. And so the result of the coalescence of action and institutions around core ideas is the production of cliches, which Orwell hated, of course, who's the master theorist of propaganda. And then, thank heavens, because there is such a thing as political competition revives thought, actually, begins to work against cliches, and restores competition among sound bites. Okay, and it's just an ongoing, constant process with my argument. Now, I have made sound bites sound like, or at least I hope I have, made sound bites sound like a valuable part of democratic discourse. That is perhaps a plausible argument, but on the other hand, we spend most of our time decrying their role as elements that degrade our political discourse. So why? What is it that we have to worry about with sound bites? Again, Aristotle is helpful. Whenever you wish to arouse emotion, do not use an enthymeme. Again, a formally expressed logical argument. For it will either drive out the emotion or it will be useless. For simultaneous movements drive each other out, the result being their mutual destruction or weakening. This is essentially an argument about the relationship between passion or pleasure and reason. The idea is that the elements of logical argument in sound bites work against the experience of emotion or passion or pleasure. So the paradox is that, in fact, sound bites are a kaleidoscope of pleasure. For example, maxims are of great assistance to speakers because of the unsophisticated character of the audience, who are pleased if an orator, speaking generally, hits upon the opinions which they specially hold. Right? That's the pleasure of feeling right and the pleasure of being bound in community with someone, the speaker, whom one admires. And easy learning is naturally pleasant to all, and words mean something, so that all words which make us learn something are most pleasant. And we can spell out the types of pleasure in sound bites. They're sonic or embodied pleasure. All that alliteration, it's not just that it helps us remember, we enjoy it in the same way that we enjoy the taste of chocolate or a gentle breeze across our skin. It's literally that physical. There's the pleasure of recognition, or as Aristotle called it, easy learning. And he's also explicit that there are a few basic cognitive moves that are especially conducive to easy learning: antithesis, metaphor, and what he calls vividness, which I won't go into for now, but our own fixation with images is an element, or is represented by that idea of vividness. Pleasure, again, of being bound in community with someone one admires, and the pleasure of knowingness. Sound bites offer all of these, and all of them can therefore work against the experience of reasoning, which in itself, at least on Aristotle's account, is not supposed to be particularly pleasant. So this makes it possible to abuse sound bites by marshaling the pleasures they offer to suppress reasoning capacities. So an example, segregated schools were defended as providing an education that was separate but equal. What's the source text? So what's the text that, I mean, it's true that this phrase was used in Brown versus Board of Education, but there's a text that everybody knows really well that lies behind this. Okay? The separate and equal station is the achievement the colonists were after when they revolted from Britain, the separate and equal station of an independent power on the globe. So the folks who came up with the separate but equal phrase were we're taking the positive charges that we associate with essentially a sacred text, equivalent to a sacred text for a political community, and mobilizing those positive charges to defend something quite different. With a critical difference, separate and equal became separate but equal, and that change means a lot. The colonists were aiming for an equal status that could be achieved only through separation. Therefore, separation and equality were parallel concepts and came together in tandem. They had to be paired for either to be meaningful. The but confesses that the separation in the context of school segregation could not generate equality, and therefore one had to say separate, and so you begin to think unequal, but to deny the necessary implication of the separation, equal. So the but is working against the force of the facts, and that conceptual change in the one to the other, I would argue, is obscured. People are diverted from it by the pleasures that come from the resonance of a phrase that is, if not immediately recognized, at least does subconsciously carry with it the positive charge of the founding document. Okay, so that's one kind of abuse, to set pleasure at work against thought. But there's another type of abuse. One can exploit confusion. So in the same way that sound bites can generate pleasure and cause pleasure, equally when they fail, they cause discomfort. Think back to that first McCain example where it was incoherent. It just leaves you feeling slightly uncomfortable. So, incoherence, difficult learning. When something's incoherent, you do not learn well from it. Actually, if anybody watched the debate last night between Obama and Clinton, lots of the commentators afterwards said about the first 16 minutes on healthcare, I was just lost. It was such a mess. I didn't really understand. Difficult learning, meant they didn't enjoy that section of the debate. So confusion is a pain. That's the basic point here. And all of that discomfort can be exploited as much as pleasure can be. So in fact, healthcare is a good example of the context where this kind of confusion and discomfort is exploited. So here are some common... That wasn't supposed to be funny. Oh, well, okay. So here are some common sound bites about healthcare. And generally, they cause confusion. In fact, it's not just my assertion, this has been documented. Let me explain first, though, why they cause confusion. I was trying to get my head around the healthcare issue over the summer and realized I was lost. And so I decided that I would try to do a sort of survey of the healthcare debate in this country, the literature about it, to figure out what the terms actually meant. And I started at the beginning, so 1915 essentially, and read things up to the present. But what I've got here is a glossary of how these key words are being used and have been used really for the last 10 years. So those sound bites I just showed you, this whole list, consists of words which have an incredible variety of potential meanings, which are rarely pinned down effectively. So national can mean federally funded, or federally administered, or embracing the landmass of the United States, or decentralized forms of financing and service. All right. And universal can mean any of those four things, or universal access, or universally required participation in insurance plans, and it does usually also mean good. Compulsory can mean funded through general taxation, funded through taxation identified as funding healthcare specifically, mandatory enrollment in an insurance plan involving payment of premiums by the individual or employer, or mandatory enrollment in a fully subsidized insurance plan, as when Medicaid recipients are required to enroll in a Medicaid managed care program. Here's the rub. Sometimes the word compulsory is used to draw a contrast between, on the one hand, programs that require enrollment in and premium payments to insurance plans, and on the other hand, programs that are funded through general tax revenues. The first are called compulsory, and the latter, therefore, implicitly described as not compulsory. But this contradicts half of the rest of what one has read or heard. Okay? So in other words, the healthcare conversation is confusing just because of what's happening with the words. And I won't go through the rest of these, but the same thing applies to provide and premium, and finally plan, program, and healthcare mean whatever amalgam of the above concepts a speaker deems worthy of advocacy. I mean, I say this with regret because this is an important issue, and it is, in fact, precisely because we've become so bad at talking about it that it makes it hard to deal with. I shouldn't say one of the reasons, I say precisely because it's a key reason. As I said, confusion. In 2000, a scholar working with data from the Annenberg Public Policy Center tracked how much citizens in early voting states were able to learn about candidates' positions based on the issues that were most discussed in the news and in debates. And here is the conclusion. Our results show little evidence of learning over time about the Democrats' policy positions on Reagan's tax cuts and on universal health care. On the other hand, respondents did learn about the Republicans' positions on soft money and instant gun checks. Okay, so this confirms significant difference in rhetorical capacity between the two parties, which has, I think, in fact, operated over the last 25 years, and is also an important part of understanding American politics as they presently function. So, what happens when there's this kind of confusion? It can be exploited, and so I'm going to play a clip of a famous commercial from 1993 that is widely credited with helping to sink healthcare reform at the time. It's the Harry and Louise ad on healthcare. So this is the most experimental part of the lecture. Let's see if I can play this without having anything horrible happen. It may take a minute to come up, in fact, because it's being pulled up from YouTube. Oops, sorry. I knew there would be one thing I would forget to get precisely under control. Oh no. Shoot. Okay.
This was covered on the old plan. This was covered on the old plan.
Things are changing, and not all for the better. Things are changing, and not all from a few healthcare plans designed by government bureaucrats. From a few healthcare plans designed by government bureaucrats.
Having choices we don't like is no choice at all.
They choose.
We lose.
For reforms that protect what we have, call toll-free. Know the facts. If we let the government choose.
This was covered under our old plan.
Oh, yeah, that was a good one, wasn't it?
Things are changing, and not all for the better. The government may force us to pick from a few healthcare plans designed by government bureaucrats.
Having choices we don't like is no choice at all.
They choose.
We lose.
For reforms that protect what we have, call toll-free. Know the facts. If we let the government choose, we lose. Call today.
Back to our slideshow. And let me just point out a couple details about the text of that ad. Things are changing and not all for the better. The government may force us to pick from healthcare plans designed by government bureaucrats. The language explicitly flags the fact that it is using vagueness and confusion on behalf of its political argument, okay? So in other words, may force, and the language and not all is precisely an admission that everything is unclear, and then the conclusion of the ad is know the facts. So the point is exactly to mobilize feelings of confusion around a particular position. So, okay. The last example gives me an opportunity just to comment briefly on the issue of new media and the internet. I am not going to talk as much about propaganda as I originally thought that I was going to, so just a few points. People often worry about the internet, that it fosters in-group conversations. That is, that it gives one the opportunity to listen to and read only what already speaks to one's own convictions. Similarly, there's the worry that great factual inaccuracy circulates around the web, and Wikipedia is, of course, the best example of this. But I'd like to just throw out for your consideration the possibility that there are actually also some competing resources that the internet offers. In the first instance, it nationalizes or even globalizes discourse in a way that means politicians can no longer get away with saying scurrilous things in one context and not expect that to travel to other contexts. So in fact, there's a funny way in which the internet is forcing politicians to essentially apply sort of Kantian idea of universalizable reason to their own speeches. Will their arguments fly not only in, for example, the Deep South, but also more broadly in the country as a whole? The internet, in fact, is currently developing great capacities to support fact-checking. So, for example, the scholarly archive JSTOR, which is like Wikipedia, essentially encyclopedic, full of information about everything, but in vetted and authorized forms based on scholarship, is accessible through Google now, and it expects to get about 1 billion hits in 2008, and the rates of access to it have been going up about 40 to 50% a month. So the point of that is that the sorts of resources that are Wikipedia and so forth can be replicated in a fashion which also permits and enables fact-checking, and in fact broadly disperses the capacity for that. So one might see resources potential for improving our ability to check facts. Thirdly, the internet archives materials that could not previously be the object of leisurely investigation. So for example, that Harry and Louise ad. I can only get it because the archive is keeping it. And that means that instead of being played once and having the effect that it's had, it's now something that's available for dissection and attention in terms of analyzing how it actually worked. And in fact, if you spend too much time on the web, as you can tell that I do, one of the things that you learn is that the internet is actually promoting skills of close reading. As every politician sort of throws more sound bites out to the public, the blogs fill up with people arguing over the meaning of words and arguing over grammar and trying to pin down exactly what the sound bites mean. So I think there's probably no force that's been as powerful in generating renewed interest in the skills of close reading as the arrival of the internet. There's a paradox for you. So, with that small excursus into new media, let me just wrap things up. In my view, sound bites are a necessary and even valuable part of democratic discourse. While we citizens of democracies hope that leaders will think for themselves and do the work of having an idea about how to understand and respond to new circumstances, we don't simply take them at their word that their ideas are the right ones. Instead, we test those ideas by forcing leaders to compete for votes under intense and strained conditions that require them to compress whole world views, hopefully earned and not merely inherited, into tight summary statements. And the best protection against propaganda, against the abuse of the pleasures and discomforts of sound bites, is an education in the verbal arts and in close reading and listening. So at the end of the day, this entire lecture was a plea for attention to the work education does in fostering capacities with words. Thank you for your attention.
Professor Allen's happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Yeah. Heinrich.
Just a question for information. Could you tell us something about the history of the expression sound bites?
I'm embarrassed I can't, in fact. That was something that I meant to check, and I now realize I forgot to do that, so I'm sorry about that. Yeah, exactly. I'm going to look it up right now, but no, it's all right. So, no, I apologize. I should have looked that up. So I think, in fact, that it does relate to technology. I can't remember if it's radio or television, but I believe it's one of those technologies that first used it, and it was a technical term for taking out a particular chunk of language. So, yes.
Something about the difference between or connection between dreams and
Sure. Yes. There I am making the argument that words have multiple purposes in political life. So the one that has really been most to the fore in our public conversation is the capacity to inspire people, to motivate people to be better than themselves or to pursue higher purpose, and that's typically how we talk about it. And words are able to do that in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's because you listen to an eloquent speaker and you admire that person, and so you want to be like that person, and that inspires you to act in a different way. In some cases, the use of narrative or images can move one emotionally in a way that then changes the direction of one's action. Or one can be motivated by reasons. One can acquire a new reason for acting and then move forward. And it's essentially that last portion of inspiration that relates to the concept of ideals, but which is also a different part of an account of how words work in politics. So the point is that for, let's take the US. If you look around and think about what the United States is made of, it's made of a set of institutions, political and legal institutions, all of which started out their life as words on a piece of paper. Those words weren't written in a vacuum. There were pre-existing practices, customs, and so forth. Nonetheless, the point is that it was possible for people to put on paper a set of principles around which they wanted to organize their practices, their habits, and their institutions. And so in that sense, concepts help a community define itself and then build the concrete stuff that actually makes it work. And it's the capacity of words to do that which I actually take to be their most important political function. And so ideals are the words that do that. They also inspire, and then there are also other ways that words inspire. But one needs that whole package in order to understand how language works in politics. And right now we've been more focused on inspiration without being clear about the difference between that concept and the concept of ideals. Yep.
I found it very puzzling when I saw your Gore versus Bush, because to me, Bush was inarticulate. Absolutely doesn't know anything about words that I've ever heard, and it's not getting one place.
Unscripted, he's inarticulate, but he's had very good speechwriters. It's the truth. And you know, just look at politics for the last 25 years and you will find the better speechwriters on the Republican side. And it's something that you know, folks involved in politics should not ignore. And it's something, I think, that for folks who teach writing and language and so forth, something that they also should be thinking about. So, yep, sorry. Thank you very much. I apologize because I meant to be clearer about the role of the listener in all of this, or the reader. I take that to be the same category. And so when I was going through the slides titled Adding the Reasons, where first you have a maxim and then the reason appears, I failed to indicate that actually it's the listener's job to be unpacking the soundbite and unfolding its content in order to analyze the reasons. And in fact, the words implicit and explicit convey exactly that idea of packing and unpacking, right? So implicit is things that are folded in, and explicit is folding things out. So in a soundbite, the ideas are implicit, and you have to unpack the soundbite to make it explicit. So I like to think of soundbites as suitcases, literally, you know, sort of like your one carry-on bag. That's something you pick up and carry around, and over time, contemplate and work on unfolding. And that is the sort of listening that democratic citizens need to acquire the art of. Many do, and again, I mean, this is, thought that the internet was just sort of full of junk. It is full of junk. There's an awful lot of junk on the internet. But I've been amazed in sort of just reading these lists of comments on things politicians have said, and actually how good, and sort of once you get through the sort of sequence of arguments back and forth about what something meant, how well people actually do at unpacking those sound bites, better than I thought that we did. So, yeah, I think that's Ben. Oh, I'm sorry, we've got one going in the back here, and I'll come over there next. Yeah. Well, I mean, I was trying to, with the comments on how sound bites can be abused, I was trying to point to some of the resources that propaganda makes use of. So exploiting pleasures of various kind, exploiting confusion. There are other kinds of cognitive moves, I think, that propaganda can regularly make use of. So for example, one question that arises is, how do you tell in, say, a context like Darfur or Rwanda or something like that, when hate speech is actually an indication that you're moving towards genocidal action of some sort? So when does hate speech become kind of propaganda, which is actually driving to action? And there are a few different sort of elements to the answer to that question, which is a very difficult one. I don't think I have a complete answer. But one part of the answer is when governmental bodies and agencies start actually distributing the stuff. That's one. But then another important thing, the cognitive element, is that a common cognitive move in propaganda is to essentially spring concepts of guilt free from any judicial context, okay? And to use, for example, context of collective guilt, where a whole group of people is guilty for X or Y or Z, and that guilt is discussed in a way that no individual could ever be held responsible for specific actions. So the kinds of connections that judicial systems have over time built up between individuals and actions and ideas of responsibility are overwhelmed commonly in propagandistic material by concepts of collective guilt and so forth, whose purpose is precisely to break down those concepts that limit the use of force and violence in response to people. I know that didn't directly answer your question, but those are, I think, some of the things that flow into the use of propaganda. So.
Just to follow up observation, your notion that sound bites play into sort of constructive role in an ongoing dialogue of democratic communication in society is very helpful and very encouraging. But if you think of broader world context, it seems to me that the most successful and most powerful dictatorships and totalitarian systems have been identified precisely with the highly effective use of sound bites. What that tells me is that if sound bites are being used in a democracy that becomes fragile, and the continuing character of that democracy to no longer resist the irrational use of sound bites, then we're in real trouble. And that, I think, is something you always have to keep in mind, particularly in times of great stress. Under threat, for example, of terrorist attacks, it always endangers removing that protective shell of democratic discourse that prevents the sound bites from doing the kinds of things that make them so effectively in totalitarian society.
Yes, thank you. That's another good and important question. Yes, there's no question that sound bites can be used, as you've described, abusively for totalitarian purposes and so forth. So when I think about that problem and try to figure out, well, what are the protections against that, that's part of what leads me to wanting to offer an account of listening. And so thank you again for the previous question. I did not bring that to the fore as I meant to and should have. That is, one needs to cultivate the arts of critical listening. I'm going to call it close reading, but you could also call it critical listening. And also I think the point you're making is a very much Orwellian point. And Orwell, another sort of way in which pleasure works that I didn't talk about was pleasure helps convert these sound bites into cliches. Cliches are the same kinds of fragments of language, but ones about which we no longer think at all. And there's no question but that that's a danger to politics. And so the question is always, how do you keep starting up the motor of thought, critical thought, competitive thought? And I think there are multiple ways of doing that. So, really protecting the realm of freedom of expression is critical so that there can genuinely be critical discourse. And universities are part of that, as Peter and I were talking about before this. Making sure that the verbal arts are being taught so that people have the capacity to unpack and then also judge. But those are also all things that are done within broader political contexts. And so part of the answer to your question requires bringing in politics more broadly. So politics never stops. And in my view, my approach to politics, there's never any moment of achieving finally the garden that we're all aiming for. Instead, one always needs to be vigilant and inspire vigilance with respect to these kinds of problems. So, yes.
You made the point, or made the assertion, that the Republicans in recent years have simply had better speechwriters than Democrats. And I'm wondering if it's more than that, if there's a certain mode of thought that lends itself being encapsulated in soundbite in a world that's really more complex. I mean, one soundbite that I'm always frustrated by is the one to justify endless war, because we're fighting them there so we don't have to fight them here. Which of course is nonsense if you think about it, but it's hard to express the counter-argument and then come back to soundbite. And I suspect that there are many Republican coined soundbites that are that there's the thought being expressed rather than the skill of the speechwriter.
In some sense, I think I am trying to sort of put up a bit of a cautionary sign to that approach, in the sense that I think the arguments stand on the side of the Democrats. I don't think those are too complex to be expressed effectively in public discourse, on the one hand. And also, I think that approach can be in sort of danger of underestimating essentially the arguments being made and what that means about people's choices about the world they live in. And by people's choices, I mean when an audience is listening to a soundbite like that and makes a choice, I think they are making a real choice, and I think those who wish to criticize that choice need to understand the full implications of that choice, and that requires taking the ideas seriously. So, anyway. Well, I think the first and most important point is that this realm of political discourse is precisely about trying to make sure that everybody repeats you, right? I mean, which in the worst version becomes an Orwellian totalitarian state. If that goal is pursued in a competitive discourse, you will never achieve your goal, and there will be other people competing against you, and hopefully that helps avoid that. Nonetheless, the goal of this kind of political discourse is to be quoted. And also to have the ideas become things that nobody owns. So in that regard, originality is sort of the wrong concept to use for thinking about sound bites. That doesn't answer the question in full, however, because there are moments or contexts where a person sort of is representing themselves as expressing their own ideas. So just to be very bald, you're talking about the just words, Senator Obama's comment, just words, Declaration of Independence, and so forth. The thought is one that he has expressed in other contexts with his own words for many years. It is a thought that many other people have expressed. In that regard, it's a very common thought, and it's exactly this kind of idea about which there is no ownership. Nobody, by any means, has a patent on that idea. However, when I was working on this lecture, I had originally thought about using that quotation, and then decided not to. And the reason I decided not to was because I did want to make an argument about the speaker's vision, and I didn't feel that I could do that. So I don't have a good answer to the question of what that means exactly, but it is the case that in this domain of sound bites, the goal is precisely for originality and ownership not to matter at all. And that's how it was used, right? I mean, in other words, two political compatriots are together crafting the discourse for politics. That's how it was used. So. Yep.
I'm puzzled by your comment on anonymity and lack of authorship, which qualifies as soundbite, because particularly in an electoral context, it seems to me slightly counterintuitive. The politician in this country in an electoral context who said a few years ago, "Read my lips, no new taxes," surely didn't intend that nobody would remember who he was. Perhaps in retrospect, I'm sure he does. But in an electoral context when he was trying to make us decide in favor of voting for him,
Right.
he surely that was intentional on his part, I would have thought.
Right. Now, thank you. That's actually very helpful, and lets me point to part of the Aristotle that I was using to talk about sound bites. So that comment, "No, read my lips, no new taxes," is, it does express a judgment. It expresses a particular policy judgment. It's not a general statement. And in that regard, it does precisely require specificity and ownership. It's a promise, and promise as such is one that has to have names attached to it in order to be meaningful as a speech act. So I would say, although you're absolutely right that that's a soundbite, so what you're really pointing out is the fact that I was using the term soundbite to talk only about a subset of soundbites, which are these things called maxims, which are these general judgments. So, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Peter can decide.
We'll take your question first.
Okay. Thank you. Your first point I fully agree with. Yes, there should be a conclusion about the dangers of sound bites, and I will add one. You heard the argument about the dangers of sound bites in the talk itself and also in some of my questions, and there absolutely should be a conclusion on that point. You're quite right, so thank you. I would disagree just modestly with your use of the phrase just rhetoric. He says, well, what about in the case of people persuade people with just rhetoric? And that, I mean, there I am really an Aristotelian in thinking that every speech act is as rhetorical as every other speech act, so that one does persuade effectively through rhetoric and with good reasons and good arguments, as well as persuading in an abusive fashion through rhetoric. So in other words, rhetoric is a set of tools that can be used for good or for ill. So the question, yes, is very much how does one try to generate as much as possible sort of good use and, most importantly, good listening, good testing, and try to reduce the bad use. With respect to the second point, fair enough about the language of citizens of democracies hoping. Yes, that's an idealized vision of democracy. But I would say that the conclusion relates rather to the fact that we test their ideas by forcing them. So I'm making a claim about the electoral process and about there, in fact, being substantive judgment in it. And again, I mean, in some sense, it's not such a strong claim in the sense that that judgment could be good or bad. I'm not actually making a claim about its quality here, but I am making the point that we make definitive choices about the kinds of principles that define our world when we vote for one candidate or another.
Daniel, I wanted to come back to your remark that Republicans have better speech writers. I don't deny that that's the case, but to the extent that it's true.
Can you speak louder?
Okay.
So this is about the role of speech writers. To the extent that it's the speech writers who are crafting these eloquent sound bites, isn't the insight we're getting into our politicians diminished? We're learning a lot about the speech writers, maybe not so much about
Right.
the leaders themselves.
That's a touche, as they say. So Ted Sorensen, who was one of Kennedy's speechwriters, describes the speechwriting process as being, and I don't actually think that this description is right, but he says something along the lines of producing words that are from the heart to the heart and can be expressed by the speaker as belonging to him or herself. So I disagree with the heart-to-heart part of it. But at any rate, the second part I agree with, which is that the good speechwriter is trying to take the language of the candidate and render it in a more powerful form so that it does truly belong to that speaker. So for example, his example of what would be bad speechwriting would be if Ron Paul's speechwriter had Ron Paul say, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." Okay? But those words can't belong to Ron Paul. And so in other words, the speechwriter's job is to put words that belong with the person who's speaking them. So.
I think at this point we ought to adjourn our discussion to the reception in Ford Hall. But before we do that, I'm sure we want to thank Danielle again for joining us.
Thank you.